Kedves kollégák, ami ennek a rangos konferenciának...
Dear colleagues, what made this conference topical is the 10th birthday of our criminal code. And due to some long-standing conventions, the birthday speech is a little bit like an obituary. You can only say positive things. So I'm fully aware that it's not the right thing to point out shortcomings on somebody's birthday. And in any case, it would be rather belated to do so. But as compared to its predecessors, well, and just like its predecessors, we are not burying a child, and we are not here to give a final report, but to envisage some kind of vision. Perhaps I could give some pedagogical warnings. I must also say I'm not a school guard who is performing public duties. I would rather be a school teacher who still believes in the honesty of their work. Well, the honorable viewers are expecting some kind of scientific evaluation from me, maybe overestimating my abilities and the current state of the criminal code. As for the mainstream of the actual trends, the lawmakers were not really prepared always in drafting the law. In the general reasoning of the criminal code and in the statements following its adoption, the most frequently used word is strictness, and compared to that, the law actually focuses on further refining 4 types of repeat offenses or the punishability of those under the age of 14. So I don't think I need to explain that when it comes to being strict, it's not that I am actually raising criticism about certain aspects, but I would have been actually happier instead of talking about principles, so it would have been nice to give more emphasis to customization and individualization. Luckily, the partial rules or the detailed rules offer more room for the users of the law, and we certainly see it as a positive development. They include the theoretical extension of sanctions and also conditional custodial sentences, which have been curbed recently, or more opportunities to take away assets that were obtained through a criminal act. And as we can read in the justification, it has become necessary to create a more coherent system than before, and in some matters, we needed to run a review to reflect the punitive policies of the government in a stronger way. So there have been some conceptual changes as well, and I must say the majority of these changes are still looking for their right place in the Hungarian criminal system, which place might never be found in terms of content and form. I will come back to a few of these, but before then, we need to look at the higher stability that was hoped for and promised when the law was created. And the lawmaker clearly declared this intention because it recognized that even in our fast-paced life, we cannot actually regularly modify the criminal code. Unfortunately, something different happened. I know that we have had the pandemic, we have wars, and there is increasing tension in society. Sometimes we need to respond to changes through punitive tools. However, this pushes up the number of unfollowable modifications so high that it cannot be justified anymore. Changes in the past 10 years will be evaluated by Mr. Somora, who will speak after me, so I'm not going to go into details of this. But just as a way of scaring you, I would like to list the 11 changes that we had on our hands in the past 2 years. Natural healing and quackery had new regulations, and money laundering activities also come with different punishments. There is also a strive to curb bullying at school, bribes, tips, the protection of national assets, the conditional release or a ban on the conditional release of homicides, stricter punishment for pedophiles, interconnections between illegal access to data and drones, and then expulsion, trade-off, and again, qualified cases of homicide. So after 80 years, there was a government decree which actually set out new rules, and there was an abuse of the immunization certificate. In the past 10 years, since the code came into effect, more than 1/3 of these sections were modified. That means that modifications are made every 2 months, which is a level of activity that is much higher than had been seen previously as the undermining of legal stability. So this situation is unsustainable. So let's now see the key, most important conceptual changes. I'd like to highlight 3. I would start with the custodial sentence and the 3 grades of custodial sentence.
A büntethetőségi korhatár szelektív leszállítását és a jogos
and the supplementation of rightful defense with the so-called situational defense. It's difficult for me to explain to students why it's necessary to do a custodial arrest instead of just imposing a custodial sentence of a few days.
Ám ez nem érdemi magyarázat, nem a szankció.
But it's not actually a material explanation, because it's not sanctions that need to be adjusted to the rules of exemptions, but it's exemption regulations that need to be properly differentiated. Or perhaps we could say that the system created a more coherent system, and exoneration happens on the day when someone is arrested, or we have to wait 3 years for this. And the custodial arrests only took place in 2% of the culprits, although there was an increase by a few fractions or percentage points. There has been a decline more recently. And the system applied to youngsters, I see, is an erroneous system. And there was a short professional dispute about the justification in February 2012, just months before the adoption of the law, which said that the custodial arrest can only serve an efficient approach for young people, and without the custodial arrests, the legislative system wouldn't have the right means, and therefore it's good for young people to get into the front room of prison. And they define this as a custodial sentence, arrest of less than 1 month. Luckily, the professional bodies were more open to science, and in 2020, they managed to report 14 people hit by custodial arrest. And please allow me to make the point that I wonder whether it is indeed the right way for the development of young people instead of stigmatization. And the same goes for child criminals between the ages of 12 and 14. Here again, we have an institution that was meant to be a remedy to a lack of means. But again, some dysfunctional functions were introduced. It's not that I want the several dozens of children under 14 who commit serious crime not to feel the strong disagreement of society. But we cannot be convinced that in a formal process with the prosecutor's involvement, the personality development of such a youngster will help their development in the right way more than today in the child protection process, where instead of judges, we have child protection specialists with the right education involved. Well, the next point is something that was inherited by the criminal code.
Így az úgynevezett szituációs jogos védelem.
Well, the situational rightful defense and the rule of assumption is another example. I would risk saying that even the strictest prosecutor and judge, if they act on their conscience, they must become uncertain before they say out loudly that if someone attacks at night, they have the intention to murder, because undisputable assumption is like that. And such assumptions, which is actually an attack against the dignity of law, does not go hand in hand with the rights of the culprit. And no one will convince me either that in certain categories of crime, the exclusion by law of conditional custodial sentences will offer a more sound guarantee of repeat offense. A few more words about what we could have thought through instead of this and what it is that is still not late. And the time has passed above the right judgment or differentiated judgment of certain crimes. Today, instead of the 2-year limit set out in the Criminal Code, which is only featuring in 2 parts in the general part, under exoneration, the 3-year dividing line became dominant. And this is what we see with alternative sanctions, mediation, compensation, and the independent application of certain military types of punishment, and perhaps the list is not complete either. If it makes any sense at all to make a difference between misdemeanor and felony, maybe this is not where we should draw the line. I cannot explain to you in detail, but I think a more current job would be, and the codificators didn't have the courage to do this 10 years ago, even though it was, to me, more a matter of editing rather than content. Which means that they should have integrated the different types of crimes at the level of law, especially because in crimes where custodial sentence can be applied, a court has been making decisions in a similar process. The convergence between the two categories is also confirmed by the fact that the effective law or misdemeanor says that those who assist in crime, the continued committing of crime, private motion, etc., etc. Please let me continue further. Well, it's the criminal code that guides us in this matter. So why do we insist on splitting these crimes according to criminal track and separate regulation for these crimes? I think we could still learn from Csemegi and what he said. And when it comes to criminal misdemeanor, maybe there should be different material and regulatory tracks.
Sértések esetén a bírságok és pótlék.
And I believe that we should also add the system of fines and supplementary fines. And at the same time, we could preserve the principle of objective liability and the related sanctions. I think that would be more than enough. Dear colleagues, I am approaching the end of my presentation. And please allow me to tell you that I have now voiced some conservative criticism, and I indeed did not intend to spoil the show. I only wanted to emphasize my good intentions and my valid criticism. I think the criminal code should not serve the purposes of political popularity. I frequently hear that science is making life difficult, whereas practice is simply working as a well-oiled process. And seasonal legislation only refers to scientific principles if its current political goals substantiate that. However, we should not uncritically accept such an attitude. And today is a very prestigious occasion, and I think we should focus on a proper and worthy principle concerning how we could channel processes in a positive direction. We should be able to differentiate to a sufficient degree. I know that we have committed prosecutors, judges, defense lawyers, and the legislator may make an attempt to restrict their room for maneuver, but these people who are very well prepared and very competent will always find a way. They will never believe that everything can be left to the legislator, and we always have the mandatory precedents to rely on. Our effective criminal code is capable of fulfilling its function because we have this attitude. It is operational as a piece of legislation, and under the present circumstances, I believe it is nothing less than a proper praise on a birthday occasion. However, I do trust that there will always be people who will keep on making attempts to continually amend and improve. Thank you very much for your attention.